Hello, and welcome to the Climate Conscious podcast. I'm your host, Derval Barzey, and today I'm joined by Cailin Ruff and Stavroula Kyriazis. Welcome, Cailin and Stavroula.
Thank you. We're so happy to be here.
Cailin Ruff and Stavroula Kyriazis are third-year law students at Loyola Law School in Los Angeles, California. They are also student law clerks for the International Human Rights Center. Their law school studies have focused on international human rights issues and the disproportionate impact felt by women. Their recent work has focused on how climate change is a threat multiplier and poses a disproportionate threat to women's human rights in the Caribbean. And we're here today to talk about their passion for women's rights and climate change. So, Cailin and Stavroula, in an ideal world, human rights and women's rights would be synonymous. Human rights, which are the fundamental rights and freedoms that every person is entitled to, regardless of ethnicity, nationality, religion, gender, and any other status. However, there are many instances where women continue to face various forms of discrimination through systemic, cultural, and legal barriers that restrict their rights and freedoms, including the rights to life, health, and access to justice. And while progress has been made, there is still much more to be done to achieve full gender equality. And for us in the sustainability space, we know that Goal 5 of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals is to achieve gender equality and empower all women and girls. But by their assessment, the world is not on track to achieve gender equality by 2030. And I'll place the link in the show notes where listeners can learn more about this goal and the associated targets. But I'd love to hear from you. How would you describe the current state of women's rights globally?
Well, that's a really important and big question that we're starting this discussion with. So thank you for that question. I think, as you mentioned, women's rights are continually progressing, but this progress isn't linear. We have a lot of great gains, and we have unfortunately experienced a lot of losses too. At least here in the United States, where Cailin and I are based, women in 1974 finally got the right to open their own bank account and to get permission to open their own bank account on their own. And then in 1973, they finally got the right to abortion. So those were major gains. But recently in the United States, we lost our constitutional right to an abortion. It was overturned by a Supreme Court decision. And we don't see this fluctuation only in the US, we see it globally as well. For instance, in the Caribbean and Latin America, unfortunately, women and girls experience the highest rate of gender-based violence in the world. This is crazy. To women, we like, why are we being persecuted against and hurt because of being women? It should be a beautiful thing, a celebrated thing. And so I think, as all of us women know, we're fighters, we're resilient. We won't take no for an answer. We'll keep fighting as long as even if we're being put down. And so I have a lot of optimism because we're just going to continue to fight. In the US, we see a lot of states creating a state right to abortion. Globally, we have more women and girls in schools. We have more women in higher education, and although it might be slow at times, it might feel harsh at times, like I said, we're resilient and we're just going to keep progressing no matter what.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more in terms of women being resilient and definitely keeping up the fight until we achieve gender equality. Cailin, you wanted to jump in?
Oh, I mean, I can just echo what Stavroula said in the sense. I think when I think especially in the context of the US and women's rights, currently women have the right to go to law school, and at our law school, there's more women than men in law school. Yet at the same time, we just lost our constitutional right to abortion, but then California has codified your rights in certain ways. And so like when I'm thinking about our human rights and like our rights as women, it's this up and down flow. But I always think to be optimistic, like Stavroula was saying, I think given the context of how we have never had as many rights as we do today, even though we've lost rights, we're constantly moving in the right direction. So it's kind of like the 2-step forward, 1 step back, like concept of just like, as Stavroula said, it's not linear, but we're getting there. And I think that's the thing to focus on.
So in July 2022, the United Nations General Assembly recognized the human right to a healthy environment. And I'm kind of amazed that it only happened in 2022. But therefore, climate change is now not just an environmental crisis and a socio-economic problem, but it's also now recognized as a human rights issue. And I know this is an area of your focus, so I would love to hear from you how you see women's rights being impacted by climate change.
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting how it's not as easy of a thing. Like there's certain human rights that are very easy to understand how they're being impacted. Climate change, as you said, like is just being noticed as being like an impact to our access to human rights. And so I think of it more as like a chain reaction because it's causing a threat multiplication. And so if we even just remove climate change as an issue for one moment, as you've noted, women experience disproportionate inequalities. And that's due to like inequalities of social, cultural, economic, political, and legal inequalities. So then you add climate change in, and climate change is going to exacerbate those inequalities and create heightened issues. And so in a report that we wrote, we focused on how climate change impacts an increase to gender-based violence, livelihood, information gathering and access to information and sharing that information, water scarcity, and migration. And so kind of to give like a chain reaction example for listeners to fully understand like how climate change impacts our human rights and specifically women's rights, I think of it this way. So if women are already responsible for a disproportionate amount of household labor, specifically in the Caribbean, including collecting water, cleaning and cooking with water, then they're already experiencing an inequality based on an inequality in responsibilities with that domestic labor. And then you add an extreme weather event, which can often contaminate and cause water to become more scarce. So then contamination of water puts women at a disproportionate impact of getting a a waterborne disease, which is a violation of their right to health. So now they're not only experiencing an impact to their right to equality, they're also experiencing an impact to their right to health. And then you talk about water scarcity, and there's reports of when there's water scarcity, there's increased gender-based violence because there's more tension in the household. So then a woman is now having her right to being free from violence being impacted. And so you've just had one human right already being violated just by being a woman. And now you add climate change and you have numerous human rights being violated just because you're a woman. And that's like when you look at it in that context, you realize the gravity of what climate change is doing to women's human rights globally.
Thanks for highlighting the concept of threat multiplication. And that's exactly what climate change does. You know, whatever is already bad, it just comes in and makes it 10 times worse. One thing that really stands out to me, and you spoke about it in your report, is the link between climate change and gender-based violence, which isn't always as conspicuous as some of the other impacts. So during emergencies, especially conflicts and climate-related disasters, extreme weather events, women are at a heightened risk of sexual and gender-based violence within and outside of their families and during and after the disaster. How can legal frameworks and advocacy efforts be used to protect and promote women's rights in the face of climate change?
Well, I think one reason why your show, Derval, is so valuable is because you invite guests from all different kinds of sectors who are really working on the issue of climate change and women's rights. You had Melanie, who works in the courtrooms in this. You had Immaculata, who's working tirelessly for Indigenous women's rights. So it's really not one sector can just ignore this. We need all hands on deck. But to sort of start, any change in governments or the law begins with advocacy. It begins with a woman or a girl saying, you know what? I don't like the way I'm being treated. I want things to change. Then that one girl starts talking to her sister, her friends, her aunts, her neighbors, who turns out also feel similarly. They then begin to, maybe even not knowing, garner public support and begin demanding change from their governments. And maybe politicians, the government would like to ignore it, at one point, they're not going to be able to ignore their constituents' demands. They'll end up passing laws to protect women, and then lawyers will be there to help enforce those laws and create remedies for them. So I truly believe that everything begins with simple conversations between friends, between people you feel comfortable with. And I mean, women talking together can be dangerous sometimes. We can be up to really marvelous ideas. So, you know, it really just starts from the ground, from grassroots organizations, and it'll eventually reach the people who are in power.
At the start of our conversation, you mentioned women as fighters and being resilient. And in my work with the podcast and other advocacy work, I've come across numerous women involved in work at the grassroots and the community level to advance both climate justice and gender justice here in the Caribbean. But I'm also so inspired to see the type of work that you are doing in terms of challenging our legal systems and lobbying our governments to really take a more direct approach and more serious efforts to address climate change through a gender-sensitive lens. It's one fight to get them to address climate change, but we know that would not be effective if it doesn't take into consideration, the unique experience of women during climate disasters.
100%.
And I think the international legal framework is really unique in that sense because we have the United Nations, we have the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. And for people who don't know a lot about international law, the basis of it is that governments come together and they say, we want to make the world a better place. How are we going to do that? They create treaties together. They write this whole legal system where they're saying, I promise to adhere to this minimum standard of human rights. And if I don't follow that, I should be held accountable by the international community. And so we are lucky because, not lucky, we deserve it. But there's one international treaty called CEDAW, the Convention on the
Elimination of Discrimination Against, why do we always read
Wait, we'll say it correctly. The Convention on the Elimination
Discrimination Against
of Women.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's this big, long, fantastic treaty where women have rights. It's a specific treaty just for women's rights. And it recognizes that women have specific vulnerabilities in human rights that men and others don't have. And so that treaty was a big basis of our amicus brief that we wrote, because obviously there's nothing, unfortunately, in international law saying women have XYZ rights because of climate change. But if you piece together facts, if you piece together stories, if you piece together even these vague laws or these general laws, then people or third parties can write amicus briefs to try to persuade the courts to then understand that, wait, legally, we need to write this down. We need to cement these rights. And so I just wanted to, explain a little bit about the legal framework. And obviously there's a lot of climate change treaties too. And some of them do mention women, which Cailin and I are always happy when we control F and see girls, women, females.
But it's so limited. And this was something in our research that was so interesting was we'd be talking to women working in climate spaces. And frequently when we'd get to talking to scientists, they would say, we know that climate change disproportionately impacts women, but we haven't studied it as deeply as we should because it's just so obvious. And that to us was so shocking that there wasn't enough data to cement the fact that this was an issue, but we all know it. We all experiencing it. And so through advocacy, we have been able to build these legal connections to then create a legal framework and an argument to support this issue that, as you've noted, is so glaringly obvious and so important. And so, yeah, we're clearly very passionate about this issue and how advocacy and litigation can really advocate for like women's rights within the climate space.
So I think we'll get to how Cailin and I got into developing this amicus brief, but we know a lot about the law, but we're not from the Caribbean. We don't know the experience of Caribbean women. So I think we'll get into it later, but partnering with grassroots organization, advocates, women like yourself, Derval, who are just constantly interacting with people who are feeling this every day. Like that is the advocacy that us as legal advocates need. Listen, you can make a great legal argument, but what Cailin and I have found is that a really impactful and moving story will get people's heartstrings going, will make people stop and think, whatever my political line is, whatever my beliefs are, like we're all human at the end of the day, and that person doesn't deserve that treatment.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And you made such important points, and one of them being that even though we may not have, empirical studies and evidence, we have the lived experience of people who are living through the impacts of climate change, seeing their environments change, experiencing the effects, loss of income, increased violence. So it is real, it is happening. It is no longer a future event that we could ignore and leave for future generations to address. It's something that we are experiencing presently, and we can no longer ignore it. We have to advocate for ourselves, and we have to come together and use the tools that are available to us. And I'm so grateful that as law students, you are using the law as a tool to advocate for women's rights in general, but also specifically for Caribbean women. Yeah, so the CEDAW Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. Yeah, it's a mouthful, but it's definitely an important pillar of gender advocacy, and it's used a lot here in the region as well. Actually, on episode 51 of the Climate Conscious podcast, I spoke about the CEDAW Convention and how it ties in not only to gender equality, but to climate advocacy as well when we speak about climate justice. So in 2023, you reached out to me for, my input and assistance while you were preparing your submission to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. You were preparing an amicus curiae brief on the climate emergency and human rights. So for the listener who may not be as familiar, could you explain what is an amicus curiae brief and how it can be utilized, or how it is being utilized to support women's rights in the context of climate change?
Yeah, so an amicus curiae brief literally translates from Latin to mean friend of the court. And so generally, when you're hearing someone refer to an amicus brief, what it means is that a person or a group who is not a party to that legal action, but has an extremely strong interest in the matter, with the court's permission, is submitting a brief in the hopes of influencing how the court will make a decision. And so I think about it this way, like in any court case, one party is going to bring a legal action based on an issue they're having. And then the person who brought the case and the person the case is against are now arguing in front of a court or a jury to try to make their argument the best argument that sways the court or the jury to pick their side. And sometimes as cases are happening, particularly in the climate change sector, the impacts of a decision in a case is not going to just impact the two people involved in the case or the two parties. It's going to impact a lot of people, which means there's a lot of people out there who are very, very interested in how that case is going to be decided. And so they have the opportunity to basically ask for permission to submit a brief, adding information to help the court understand the impacts of the decision more greatly, or to basically say, hey, the parties in the case aren't arguing for this necessarily, but just so you know, if you decide this way, it will hurt my community, or will hurt this group of people, or hurt this business. And so kind of how to explain how you can use it to help women's rights in the context of climate change, I can explain like how we've now used it. And it's basically, so Colombia and Chile submitted a request for an advisory opinion on climate emergency and human rights submitted to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. And basically, the Inter-American Court was being asked to make a decision on what obligations do states have based on the impacts of climate change on human rights, and not just based on the impact of climate change on the right to health, but on the impacts on rights to specific groups. And so, and also just kind of for listeners that may not know, to explain, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights is a human rights court on the international level that is an independent and principal organ of the Organization of the American States, which the OAS is the world's oldest regional organization, apparently. And also the court is, they have jurisdiction over states that have ratified human rights treaties within the Americas. So that's why Chile and Colombia asked this court to come out with this advisory opinion, and the court wanting more information on how people saw the intersection of climate change and specific groups' human rights, asked for amicus briefs to be submitted. So we saw it as an opportunity for us to focus on a region that is responsible for very little to no emissions, the Caribbean, but they're experiencing some of the worst impacts of climate change with rising sea levels, extreme weather events, and just the disproportionate impacts felt by women. And so our brief really focused and highlighted on how the Caribbean is experiencing these impacts that are disproportionately impacting women in the region and causing violations of their human rights, because we really felt that it kind of, as Stavroula mentioned, like telling a story really helps translate what you're trying to get across. And when we're talking about how climate change impacts women's rights, if you pick a group in the region that is experiencing it the worst, you're going to make your point. And there was just so many collective stories in the Caribbean of how climate change really harmed women's access to the full enjoyment of their human rights. And at a baseline, you have the right to life. And then on top of that, you have so many rights, both regionally and globally. And we just felt in like reviewing the different rights that women in the Caribbean had, they were experiencing such an impact to being able to actually enjoy those rights. So like our amicus was our way of being a friend of the court and saying, hey, just in case you didn't already know, can you focus on these issues and make a gender sensitive lens? Because if you really want to solve climate change and you really want to solve human rights, you have to do it in tandem. And so it's one thing to create climate solutions, but if you don't do it with a gender sensitive lens, we won't solve women's human rights violations. But if you do them together, there's hope that both can get improved. And so that was like really how we found using an amicus brief to be very successful for us.
You kind of got into the answer to this question already, but you are both based in Los Angeles. What inspired you to focus specifically on advancing the rights of Caribbean women concerning climate change? And I know you spoke to us being in a region that has negligible contributions in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, but yet we are on the front line, basically. But is there any particular story from the Caribbean that stands out to you?
That's a really, oh gosh, there's so many. I'll start. There's two parts to this question. I think first, how we even got into this in the first place. It started, I want to say, I think Cailin and I began our efforts in women's rights in about 2021. We had been invited to the United Nations in Geneva to speak about abortion access in Malawi. And we realized that we were one of the few organizations there speaking about women's rights, let alone abortion rights. And we actually went in person and we were like, wow, this is crazy that nobody else had talked about women's rights when Malawi as a country was being reviewed about its human rights abuses. And so we really became passionate. We're like, all right, we're two law students. Like, we're in this amazing clinic under Professor Romano is his name. How can we just get our hands on every kind of like women's issue that we want? And so that's supplemented with the fact that, everyone knows climate change is like one of the biggest issues that we're dealing with today. So we went to our professor and we said, all right, we care about women's and girls' rights. We care about climate change. What do we do about that? Mm-hmm. And he told us that the Inter-American Court was requesting submissions from third party, as Cailin mentioned, in his curious briefs. And so that's where we began researching, wow, all right, what's an area where, as Cailin said, low emissions, but one of the highest impacts. That's where we got to Caribbean. And I think the first part was that, as I've mentioned before, like Cailin and I know the law, we don't know experiences of people. So that's where we began reaching out to you, Derval, and then Sapphire from the Caribbean Feminist, Aisha from Girls Care, Christine from the Redford Collective, Dana Lynn, who I think you and her just did a podcast together, from Global Yachty. And we all sat down together individually, and Cailin and I were like, we're going to write this brief. We're like free legal help. Like, what do you all and what do your friends and family say? What are the biggest impacts that you all are feeling, your friends are feeling? And you give us that, and we're going to construct a legal argument. And I think the biggest thing that we all came to consider was the biggest threat was to gender-based violence. So we worked really hard to really look at stories and find them. And Cailin, do you want to say any specific stories?
Yeah, like the first thing that came to mind actually is a tandem of not just gender-based violence, but also like the ability to collect and share information. And that was my other big thing. Like, this is wild to me. We've talked a lot about how women are fighters, how like we're strong. And because of that, women also, we are our strongest when we share information, when we talk. And the fact that women, particularly Indigenous women, have been being persecuted for sharing that information and experiencing violence because they're talking and because they're trying to get the disproportionate impacts that they're experiencing out there to the public was just heart-wrenching. And that's particularly something that I know like was hard for us. And speaking with partners, like we learned about Alicia Foster, who in 2017, who worked in Guyana, and she was murdered. And that's, sorry, like it makes me so upset to tell these stories, but they have to be told. But like, she was murdered for sharing information, and the government didn't do anything about it. There was no research into it or investigation into it. And so we're talking about this story where this woman is killed for being a woman who spoke, who shared information, and the government just tried to forget about her. And that's just a really hard thing to recognize, that was the stories we were collecting. And I think, you know, the SCUSA agreement that was enacted to try to protect the sharing of information. But at the same time, like, women are still being persecuted. So I guess like when you say like any specific stories, I think women being persecuted for sharing information was the one that was really hard for me to grapple with, because although it's something we know that happens every day, it's the thing that has to happen to make change. And like, it's really sad that as we're making progress in our rights, we're losing so many valuable women that are part of the conversation to violence. And like, that's something that I think was really impactful for like me in the research particularly.
And just to add on to that, with I'm so sorry, I don't know how to pronounce it, the Escazú agreement, you know, this is an incredible agreement. 25 countries are getting together saying people need to be able to talk about climate change. Journalists need to be able to talk, like, inform people about this. But again, I feel like there's no mention of girls, women, female in there. And in Guyana, you know, females, a lot of female communities like Red Thread are the ones who are really advocating for this and getting the point across. And the fact that the governments, although they're making progress, they're just kind of ignoring the efforts that women are putting in. It's just like, come on, like they're risking their lives, and like you won't even mention a girl or a woman or a female in there. So I just wanted to, as great as that is, I think it goes to your first question, Derval, of how do you say women's rights right now? Like, it's great, but like, we're still not being included in the places we need to. The disproportionate impact that women are facing is still just not being voiced in these things.
I'm just really sick of women losing their life for fighting for like basic human rights. That's just like something that I think was like a really common thread in this, is like the violence that women experience for advocating for something that would benefit everyone.
Just because they're a woman.
Yeah. Like, women are advocating for climate change, which would literally
help like, everyone.
Like, everything they're advocating for helps every single person.
Yeah.
Yet they're being persecuted for it. And like, that, you know, look, if you are not contributing to a problem, you should not be the person experiencing the impacts. And like, to come back to like why the Caribbean mattered to us, like, we're talking about a region where like women are not contributing to this issue. They just are not. And yet every day they wake up and are at risk of persecution. And that is just, I mean, like, we got into human rights law because we don't believe people should be persecuted, because we believe people should enjoy their human rights, because we're passionate about this. And as women who have privilege but felt like we were at disadvantages even in like America, and then to read stories about women who like do not even have remotely close to the privileges that we get to experiencing even worse disproportionate impacts and persecution was just, it's one of those things where information is knowledge. And when you have knowledge, you have to share it. It is not fair to be informed and not advocate. Like, that is not using your knowledge wisely. And so when we learned information with working with incredible partners, there was no longer a question if this is something we wanted to do. It was something we had to do because we now had the knowledge and the ability to make a legal argument, and it had to be made.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing those stories, those very sobering facts, the thing that some of us take for granted. Women are actually put at risk and even losing their lives to defend it. And it highlights the importance of coming together to protect our environment and our environmental defenders. And I note your points, Cailin, about the Escazú agreement. It's a good tool, but of course, there's more to be done. Focusing on the needs of women. As you can see, this space in terms of environmental justice, and climate action is dominated by women. It's so strange that not everyone is on board, because when we secure and we safeguard a healthy environment, it's to everyone's benefit.
Yeah.
But, but we press on, and this work is done through partnerships. The region itself is fragmented. It's a group of islands spread across the Caribbean Sea. And while we may have cultural differences, we have that common experience, one of colonialism, but also of experiencing this climate crisis in a very real way. So you prepared and submitted the amicus curiae brief, and since then, you ladies have been very busy. So, what progress has been made in your advocacy, and what's next for you?
Wow. Yeah. Since the first time we spoke with you, it's been a crazy, incredible, beautiful experience of, partnerships that have led to such wonderful advocacy in like numerous realms. And I think like there's a few different ways that advocacy is very effective. And for us, we've kind of gone with like two routes that have really helped us utilize like our knowledge of advocacy to like be successful. And one was obviously using our understanding of international legal systems to like write the brief, but also as importantly, we've had such an opportunity to share important information. As like we were just talking about, like sharing information is so important. And so I'll get to like the future of our brief and all the exciting things like that, but I just kind of want to highlight for a second some of the incredible opportunities we've had, like with grassroots information sharing, that we've had the opportunity to be a part of in this past year. And so recently we actually had a really incredible opportunity to speak with mentors and mentees at Girls Care Jamaica about international advocacy and how to do it through legal frameworks, specifically through parallel reports. And it was so cool to be able to share information with incredible women and girls working in climate justice spaces and be like, hey, here's like this really cool international legal thing that if like you feel like something domestically is not being done, here's a way to like talk about it internationally. Like, here's how you can do it. You don't need to be a lawyer. You can do this. And like, that was such a great opportunity and experience. And then this month, we got an article published in Ms. Magazine, which is a US-based feminist magazine, on how water scarcity in Jamaica is impacting women's rights and causing them issues with like their right to health, their right to equality, their right to be free from gender-based violence, and also just in general how climate change is impacting women in Latin America and the Caribbean at large. And then obviously today we have the honor of speaking with you, which is now going to further disseminate this information to so many more people to start thinking, what can I do? Like, how can I join this conversation? Oh, like it's 2 law students in California that are doing this work. I don't have to be a lawyer that is working for the United Nations or someone at a high level. Like I can just be someone passionate that collects some information, talks to important people that have the knowledge and just share it. And like that is doing something. And so like that actually work has been really incredible to see how like our community has allowed us to grow in that sense. But then like at the international legal level, our brief got accepted by the court and they've invited us to Brazil in May to continue the conversation at a hearing where we'll get a brief period of time to speak on why we think the court should use a gender sensitive lens in its conclusion. And so our current aim and goal is to probably hopefully share a narrative story to kind of compel the court to see our point, as well as to just really emphasize that climate change is disproportionately impacting women's human rights. And if we don't use a gender sensitive lens, we will forget these women and we will lose these women and their rights will be more impacted and they will have more disparities and it will negatively impact any progress we've made. So like any progress we're making within the climate sector has to be made in tandem with progress in the gender equality sector. And so like that's our hope, is that by going to Brazil and speaking in person at this hearing where other people who spoke briefs have been invited to speak at the hearing, that we will hopefully get the court to see the importance of a gender sensitive lens. And so, yeah, we're busy.
I will say, I don't know when this is going to air exactly, but if any of your listeners have really just impactful stories or experiences that they say, you know what, I want someone to know about this. I want something to happen about this. Like, I think we'll share our LinkedIn's, like, please let us know. Cause right now, like, we don't have much time when we're presenting to the court. So we want to just, we want to bring the voice of someone who wouldn't be there otherwise, who they might not even think of being there otherwise, and be like, look at this. This is in your face now. What are you going to do about it? And I think Cailin forgot to mention, like a month ago, we got asked by our professor to write up a little report about the disproportionate impact that climate change has on the education of women and girls. And he was like, oh, just throw it together, ladies. Like, this is your thing. Like,
we wrote a report in 5 days.
Yeah, we wrote a very long, difficult report in 5 days, but that just kind of shows like anytime like any of our supervisors, any of our partners, like, oh, by the way, this is still happening, Cailin and I are like, let's just get a report in because it's very likely nobody will do so otherwise.
And I think like really we're so lucky to have met all of our partners, like speaking with you. And like, I always want to highlight Sapphire because Sapphire, like truly like
Sapphire Alexander,
like we messaged her and she got back to us and we're like, we're trying to get all these people to respond to our messages. And she's like, let me message them because I know them. And suddenly like we had this beautiful team of incredible contributors to our brief who have now permitted us to be in these conversations with them that is expanding this information. And I feel like every day I see more things like online where people are like starting to talk about this, like climate change is a women's issue. Climate change is a women's issue. And I keep seeing more and more and more of that. And it gets me so excited that like advocacy works, conversations work. Like your podcast is doing wonders. Like conversations and like mentorships is doing incredible things. And like all these things are adding to a conversation that is growing. And I just think that like the future is really bright for like what can come of all this advocacy. And I really do think that I have such hope that in the near future, both on a domestic and international level, like we are going to see so many more laws and policies that address climate change with a gender sensitive lens, because the conversation is happening and it's getting louder and louder. And I feel a lot of hope with a lot of climate fatigue.
Oh yeah.
I still feel hope.
Cailin and I will, and if that doesn't happen, Cailin and I will continue to submit parallel reports and amicus curiae briefs. And yeah, the last thing I want to say in that point is that Derval, every single one of our partners, you all had the ideas. We just wrote them down.
Yeah.
That's what happened in this partnership. And I think that's the most beautiful part. Yeah. A lot of mutual respect between us and you all, I think, was really what made this work, and passion.
Yeah.
Well, I must thank you, Cailin and Stavroula, for your dedication to advocating for the rights of women and for putting your legal studies, using your time and your resources on behalf of Caribbean women. I think you added a new dimension, or you expanded, the legal dimension of our advocacy work that we have been engaging in at the grassroots level and at the regional level. So we're really happy to have you as a partner with us, helping to amplify our voices and to attack this issue from all sides. This work is complex and at times it is tiring, but we find the energy, we find the fire to keep going through our community, our regional and our international community, to really continue, as you said, sharing important information and showing decision makers and all stakeholders why we need gender sensitive climate strategies. So, as we conclude this very enlightening episode, I would love to hear from both of you. What would make the world a better place?
What a question.
The podcast could have just been about that.
It's a long list.
I'll keep my answers simple. I think more empathy and more access to education. I think if people are empathetic, they understand each other, they're willing to listen to each other's problems and find solutions. We're people at the end of the day and we care about other people. Secondly, education. I truly do think education is power. I love that more women are in school, but let's keep them in school. Let's keep not just women at the end of the day, everyone in schools, especially people from minority communities. And let's make sure not only they're in school and finish school, but that they succeed in school. We wrote a lot about this in the paper that I told you about with education and climate change. And I just really think knowledge is power. And that's why we're here today.
Yeah, and of course, like echoing everything Stavroula said, like education is so important. And also like data collection by our governments is extremely important. And if there was more data, I think the world would be a better place because we'd understand better like what the problem is specifically and how to solve it. But like I think the main thing I'd add is something I've been thinking about a lot recently, which is if more people listened, I think the world, especially in light of climate change, would be better. Because I think a lot of the issues with climate change have solutions out there and answers out there. And I think specifically women frequently have the solutions and answers. And so if more people in power were listening to women and asking them for their input and how things could be done, I do think that we could achieve our goals and at a quicker rate. And so like, I would love to see more listening, more education, more data collection. And I think like something also like important to always add when you're talking about like what would make the world a better place is to acknowledge like climate fatigue is so real. And I think in this work, like it is really exhausting sometimes, but it's really important to remember to fight, to work with your community and to lean on your community because like the world will be a better place. Today is a better day than it was 100 years ago. And we're fighting harder than ever, I think. And I really do think like we will reach the goals we all dream of. And like, I truly think we can make the world a better place. So like, we have to fight the climate fatigue. We have to lean on our community. We have to like educate. We have to converse with each other because like, I do have so much hope that the world's going to continue to become such a better place to live and such a more loving and wonderful place for women and girls to coexist with every other person. And like these intersectional issues will get addressed. And like, I think the world can be a better place.
Derval, can we ask you what you think the world will make a better place? I'm sorry. You don't need an answer right now. It's difficult.
No, thanks for putting me on the spot, but no, I know this is going to sound corny, but I think if people operate from a place of love and understanding, we often focus on the things that separate us or make us different. But if we just look at each other as human beings, we would recognize that we are all, navigating this thing called life. And as you mentioned, empathy, I think empathy, compassion, love, whatever you want to call it. I think if we operate from that space, we would eliminate so many issues.
Yeah.
Sometimes the simplest solutions are the best ones.
It's true, though. I was thinking about this the other day. Like, you never know what someone's going through, and like using empathy to address every situation is just, it truly is the solution to so many problems.
Yeah.
It's such a simple one. But no, that's not corny at all, Derval.
We love it.
But those were two solid answers from you. So I must say Cailin and Stavroula for President of the United States.
Please. Wait, what would we be? 20, what year would it be?
We have to wait till you're 35, so like in another decade.
All right, give us a decade, Derval. We'll be back.
And I'm definitely looking forward to hear about the outcome of your presentation at the hearing in Brazil.
Yep, you'll be getting a big email blast from us. Probably a photo as well.
Yeah.
So how can listeners connect with you and follow your work?
I think LinkedIn is the best way. It's just our full names. That's where Cailin and I aren't great at the PR aspect of our work. We're trying to get much better at it though. So that's where we've started posting what we're doing and just keeping people like in the know about it. Not because like our professor has taught us to be super humble about this work and not not boast about it, but we realize we need funding to go to Brazil and do these things. And we want to literally we posted one thing on LinkedIn and we got so many connections and we're like, oh, this is dangerous.
So find us on LinkedIn.
Yes, please.
If you're someone with a lot of money, we don't yet get paid for anything that we're doing. So also this work takes funding. And also if you're someone who's like, I'm having this issue and I want to know, like, we'll warn you that we're about to be studying for the bar so that we can become lawyers in America. But you should definitely message us on LinkedIn, everyone. Please, and let us know that like you have something that you think is a human rights violation. Like we are always happy to discuss like what avenues there are and like how to do stuff. And like the International Human Rights Center at Loyola Law School is always looking for like more advocacy work and litigation work that they can do to advocate for human rights. And our professor that supervises it, Cesare Romano, is just such a wealth of knowledge and always very like supportive and like works from a place of so much love and like support. So like, don't hesitate to message us on LinkedIn.
Please do. I'll send you my WhatsApp right away. We'll hop on like a phone call. It'll be like Cailin and I are so passionate about this. We'd much rather be doing this than some of our other responsibilities.
Yeah.
So yeah, LinkedIn, please.
I completely get you. I will definitely place the links to your LinkedIn profiles in the show notes. And definitely any funders that are listening, please get in touch with Cailin and Stavroula and the Climate Conscious podcast.
All of us working in this sphere need more funding.
Yes.
So please feel free to send everyone working tirelessly on this more funding.
So this brings us to the end of this episode. I'm so glad that we were able to sit down and talk about your work and your motivations and also your outlook on, what's next in this space. I think it's really an issue of the glass half full or half empty. But I think through our community, we can really encourage each other to look at the glass as being half full and that our efforts are contributing to getting to a full glass at some point.
Yeah. The glass is fuller than it has ever been, and it will keep filling.
I love that. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to speak with you. And also just like, we appreciate you, the work you're doing, and the community that we have so much. So like to anyone listening, like join this community of incredible people, keep fighting, and just really, really, we're both so deeply grateful.
Thanks for tuning in to the Climate Conscious podcast. We hope you found today's episode interesting, informative, and inspiring. Visit theclimateconscious.com for more info. I'm Derval Barzey, and this is the Climate Conscious podcast.